Change the slides, and it's page up, page down. Okay. That's the easiest. There's a way of doing it on the screen.
איפה הקולות? נא לתפוס מקומות בבקשה. אני רוצה להזכיר, אני אומר את זה בעברית, נא לכבות פלאפונים. את זה אפשר להגיד בעברית, באנגלית אנשים אני מניח מבינים את זה. אוקיי. אתה מתכוון לזה? Exactly. I welcome you all. We are very proud that the OECD chose our school to be the place to present and discuss their economic survey of Israel. This is the second time in a row that we host the OECD mission. This year, we will mark the 10th anniversary of our school that is committed both to excellence in research as any other department in the university, but also committed to advancing the vision of making the public sector more efficient and responsive to the benefit of the Israeli society. The productive discussion we will have today is just another way to advance the vision of our school. So without further ado, I would like to invite the president of Hebrew University, Professor Menachem Ben Sasson, to say a few words of welcoming. Please.
Dr. Dahan, dear guests, members of the school, we are honored and happy that the first report that all Israel was getting up this morning to look at, and that's the mirror of who knows, the queen or the daughter of the queen, but it is a picture of ourselves, to read what we read. We wanted to be part of this family of nations for many years. Many of us, of this school, I wasn't a member of this school in these years, read about it, wrote papers about it, were involved in the day-to-day work of the government and of the legislative body in order to reach to this point. It wasn't easy. One of them, nowadays one of us, is Dr. Yaron Mariav, whom I remember to be the Lord Protector of the process in the Knesset. At that time he was the Director General of the Ministry of Finance. It's not an easy job. We were accepted. Being accepted is not only to have a merit that you go with a label, we are part of the OECD. From time to time you get a report card. And we are very happy to read this report. Everybody takes pages, so I would take the pages about education and competitive grants. I would take the pages about balancing a budget, what is the power of it. Each and every student in this institute knows how important it is and how difficult it is to reach, because it's not to read about, but to make. It's like a juggler work. They are the ones who are going to do it in no time. You are the ones to come again and to show to us whether the education you gave was the report that you prepared justifying the education. It's a triangle. It starts here. It goes to the other part of the town, namely next to the other campus, to the hill, in order to make the legislation and the executive to make the decisions. And then it is for you to come in again and again to compare and to put a mirror again to say, you are successful or no. We know. That's the way we work. Not every politician would love to have it, but it is an essential part of our education. It is only one report of OECD. There are many, many other aspects. I don't want to go to the classes that you give on these reports or these chapters of legislation and commitment. It is needed for a sober country and for a very responsible institute in this city and this country to follow in the years to come. So we commit ourselves to be part of the process. We expect you to come again and to show us what have we got to do in the future. And it's more than just a commitment. It's part of the schedule, part of the curriculum. And that's the way we see yourselves, students, as leaders of tomorrow, being responsible to what you learn today in both ways. Thank you very much.
I would like to invite the Dean of Social Sciences Faculty, Professor Avner Beshalit, please.
Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome. The fact that the OECD chooses this school for presenting its report is really flattering, and I regard it as a compliment, and I would like to thank Momi and everybody in the school, the academic and administrative staff, for organizing this event. The President has just said how much Israel was eager to join the OECD, and how the OECD and how being a member of the OECD implies certain obligations in terms of economic policies and regulations. I cannot escape saying something which goes beyond the economy. it seems to me that being a member of the OECD implies also some moral obligations. And Israel now is witnessing an exclusion of women from public policy, from public space in many areas and by many groups and firms and municipalities. And there is a strong and fierce debate about it in Israel. And I really wish and hope that our leaders will agree with us, I hope, that being a member of the OECD implies not only economic obligations that will be discussed today by you and Sharon Gilad and Claude Barabi, but also some moral duties, and that it implies being civilized in a broad sense. Thank you for coming, and I hope to enjoy your talk.
What we will have now is a presentation of about 35 minutes by Peter and Philip, Peter Jarrett, Dr. Peter Jarrett and Dr. Philip Hemmings. And after that, Dr. Claude Barabi and Dr. Sharon Gilad will discuss their report. So please.
So following up on that, I guess I could say that one of the key words when there is a discussion of a new member country to the OECD is like-mindedness. And so I could only say that, speaking personally, I support very much the Dean's choice of that particular aspect as being one that's crucial to like-mindedness. It's a very great pleasure for Phil and me to be here this evening for this presentation and discussion. No doubt few of you know that we already spoke to a similar audience 2 years ago on the occasion of the release of the first OECD Economic Survey of Israel when you were not yet members. The latest survey was made public yesterday, and we look forward to hearing your views on the policy advice that our member countries have authorized us to transmit to your government. The areas that we are covering in this survey are macroeconomic and financial sector policies, energy and environment, and the housing market. Now, I will make the first part of the presentation and Phil will follow up. No, sorry. No, I've done it. Got to go all the way back through. Sorry. Went the wrong way. Okay. There. Let me begin by situating Israel's growth performance in recent years. In the mid-2000s, Israel's economic growth began to systematically exceed those of the OECD and to at least match the world total. While you too suffered from the 2008-2009 downturn, year-on-year growth never actually turned negative. And with the 2010-11 recovery, the expansion returned to the near 5% annual pace enjoyed for several years prior to the crisis. Well, I still haven't gotten used to this. Okay. Why did that disappear? This isn't normal either. There, that's better. The healthy pace of recovery from the 2008-9 crisis has been job-rich. The unemployment rate has fallen to the lowest level for many years, and the labor force participation rate has been rising. Israel now enjoys an unemployment rate that is nearly 2.5 percentage points below the OECD average. Nevertheless, participation remains well below the OECD average, about 3.5 percentage points. Let me get this right. Still not. Gotta keep my finger there. Also, our assessment is that Israel's cyclical position is that supply and demand seem to be pretty close to balance. But the news is not all good. It will not surprise anybody that the euro area is leading the world into another period of very slow growth, even if not outright recession. The foreign trade channel is, of course, the primary means by which the global business cycle is transmitted to Israel, and year-on-year growth in exports has weakened considerably, culminating in an outright fall in export volumes year-on-year in the third quarter. Imports have been better maintained, mainly because of the strength of domestic demand, which had shown no signs of easing by the third quarter. Furthermore, Israel's longer-term per capita GDP performance has been rather unexceptional. Even after 8 years or so of catching up, GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms relative to the top half of OECD countries is now only just back to where it was in the mid-1990s. The shortfall is still around a quarter. It is possible that this latest phase of catch-up will continue, but this does not give grounds for complacency in efforts to improve the macroeconomic and structural policy frameworks. And crucially, on the social side, the fruits of those improved standards of living over the past 8 years have not been shared very evenly, and income distribution has become ever more skewed. More on that later. So if you can read it, these are our latest set of projections that were released about 2 weeks ago, and we've included them in yesterday's survey. We call this a muddling through scenario that assumes that there is no financial catastrophe, and thus the probability of something much worse is fairly high, while there is only a small chance of anything much better. We would term the outcome for Israel something like fair to middling, with 2.9% real output growth projected for 2012 and 3.9% for 2013. This represents substantially better performance than in many other OECD countries, though remember that Israel's relatively rapid population growth partly drives this relatively good outcome. But I think you'll agree that if realized, such an outcome will allow policymakers to breathe a sigh of relief. In a downside scenario, growth could well be several percentage points weaker in both years than in the baseline. In other words, a repeat of 2009 is by no means out of the question. Now let me turn to policy matters. The recent and current conjuncture for monetary policy is, of course, exceptionally difficult. Until recently, policy was attempting to strike a balance between, on the one hand, worries about housing and commodity price increases and the inflationary implications of the rapid pace of recovery in output growth, and on the other hand, concerns about the impact of policy rate increases on the exchange rate and consequently export growth. These considerations led the Bank of Israel to conduct a series of moderate rate increases with a view to returning monetary policy settings to those that existed prior to the 2008-9 crisis, but also combined this with active intervention in the foreign exchange market, which I shall discuss in a moment. In light of the gloomier economic prospects, the softening of the housing and primary commodity markets, and falls in inflation expectations and outcomes, the normalization process has stopped. Indeed, the Bank of Israel cut the policy rate for October and again for December. We expect it to cut further, another 50 basis points by early next year, and then hold it there until the middle of 2013, when about something like 100 basis points of tightening should occur by the end of that year as the economy gets back up to speed. One of the key issues for monetary policymakers in recent years has been the level of the shekel. Consistent with the real performance of the economy, it had been strengthening since the beginning of 2006 and began to surge in 2008. The Bank of Israel then began its intervention policy, which prevented the exchange rate from returning to the lofty heights reached in the early years of the decade. No interventions have been conducted since the summer. But while the authorities used the argument that foreign exchange reserves are of around 15% of GDP in early 2008 were a little short of desirable levels, the quasi-doubling that occurred by late 2009 put Israel at the top of the league of comparable countries. Only Switzerland's reserves rose faster and higher because of its safe haven status in these times of extreme risk aversion. The cost of having all these reserves is, of course, that they tend to earn pretty much zero interest rates, while the extra borrowing that they engender in shekels must pay much higher rates, thereby creating a true financial burden for the exchequer. The additional reserves might be costing something near 0.5% of GDP at present. We argue that such interventions should probably have ceased earlier because they risk confusing market participants that the authorities may not have been so single-mindedly focused on inflation. But with foreign monetary policy settings admittedly rather extreme, it was perhaps no surprise that some systematic intervention to restrain the appreciation took place until July. In any case, the general rule should be that intervention is only appropriate to stem the tide of destabilizing capital inflows and not to try to avoid changes in the exchange rate that are justified by improving Israeli fundamentals. Our survey also goes into depth into a number of issues of private sector finance following the experience of the 2008-9 credit crunch and ensuing slowdown. In contrast with a number of other OECD countries where households have proved the most in need of deleveraging, Israeli households have managed to keep debt fairly stable in relation to GDP, even if bank loans for housing have surged, much to the consternation of Governor Fisher. This is in part because they have substantially run down corresponding loans from government. It is business borrowers that have raised their indebtedness, at least until the crisis. That extra supply of credit has been supplied in the form of bonds issued by a variety of kinds of firms and purchased mainly by institutional funds and directly by households. The result is one of the largest corporate bond markets in the OECD, as you can see in the left-hand panel. Our take is that the reforms following the HODEC recommendations go in the right direction, but they may not ensure good performance in the bond market. And we are especially concerned about those issued by the real estate sector, given the real possibility of housing price declines. Turning specifically to the banking sector, we observe that financial excesses were avoided in the run-up to the crisis, thanks to conservative practices and effective supervision. Here you will see a number of risk and capital adequacy indicators that point to a sound position for the industry as a whole up until the end of 2010. Nevertheless, we endorse the Bank of Israel's call for an update of the banking legislation that would give the governor and the supervisor of banks more power to make early interventions to head off threats to banks' stability. And while as economists we believe that securitization is a good thing in principle, we recognize the excesses that it engendered in some OECD countries where it was inadequately regulated. And thus we would remind the authorities of the need to proceed cautiously and with appropriate safeguards with their liberalization plans. Another issue we tackle is household savings, especially pension savings. Following the 2010 Labor Management Agreement to raise pension contribution rates to 17.5% by 2014, our internal pension models show that Israel will have some of the highest after-tax replacement rates in the OECD, especially for low-income workers, even after recognizing that contributions also cover severance pay. Thus, no further increase in pension savings is warranted. Otherwise, the range of pension products is broad, perhaps excessively so, resulting in a suspicion that many people are making poorly informed choices. Streamlining the products would no doubt be a good idea. Finally, the tax treatment of pension savings deserves another look, as does that of advanced training funds. we feel there is little justification for giving such savings access to preferential rate government bonds, and even more obviously, it is wasteful to continue to provide tax breaks on the mandatory component of pension savings. And tax credits on payouts should also be reconsidered, since they benefit mainly affluent Israelis. We have a number of other pieces of financial sector advice as well. First, the authorities have obviously been right to be concerned to cool off the housing market before prices reached bubble proportions. We endorse all the macroprudential measures they have taken. However, the toolkit has not been exhausted, and if the early signs of cooling are not confirmed in the coming months, we would have no hesitation in recommending that both further tightening and faster land release by the ILA, the Israel Land Administration. On the other hand, if the correction should look too abrupt, as Governor Fisher, for example, fears, threatening financial stability, then repealing the measures recently taken would likewise be appropriate. Second, while best practice in the design of financial supervisory architecture is still being debated throughout the OECD, it is clear that having a three-agency structure, as in Israel, requires strong coordination. Laudable efforts are being made in that direction in Israel, but they may not prove sufficient. In any case, there are risks of meddling in having the supervision of capital markets, insurance, and savings in the Ministry of Finance, when they could be avoided if the relevant division were moved away. We also support plans to publish a regular financial stability report. Let me now turn to fiscal policy. Israel's public finances have some fairly unique characteristics. Successive governments have not only managed to bring expenditures down from over 60% of GDP in the mid-1980s to below 45% now, nearly wiping out the gap with the OECD average, but they have also cut revenues by at least as much. And nevertheless, gross public debt has been falling almost uninterruptedly in relation to GDP, and is now well below OECD outcomes. The government's record of meeting its deficit targets is good, other than in 2008 when it missed modestly for good reason, and then in 2009 and 10 when original targets were raised because of the unforeseen economic weakness. Deficits have come in below target every year since 2003. In other words, government's tax and spending levels seem to have been a stabilizing force in the economy. Yet Israel now stands at a point where there are sharp trade-offs between debt reduction, spending control, and tax reform, all heightened by pressures from the recent tent protests. We strongly support the medium-term goal of reducing debt further to 60% of GDP, a useful milestone, by aiming for a deficit below 1% of GDP by 2014. But a catching-up economy with a great deal of volatility should probably go further in the longer term. What is remarkable about Israel's public spending is that while it is now about the same share of GDP as in the average OECD country, its structure is quite different. The average country allocates about 1% of its GDP to defense, but Israel is an outlier, with military outlays at around 7% of GDP. While we believe that the overarching objective must be to reduce the deficit and resulting debt, we welcome the new spending rule that loosens up a bit on spending over its predecessor. And as I said earlier, we are cognizant that relative poverty is high. Our colleagues have just published some disquieting income distribution numbers last week. There are crying needs for improved infrastructure, and public sector pay may in some cases have been driven to unsustainably low levels. But while a judicious easing of spending limits is defensible, even faster spending rises would seriously endanger the attainment of the debt targets, whose attainment will on their own require difficult budgetary decisions, or what the Bank of Israel calls prioritization. If social spending is to be boosted further as demanded by the tent protests, then either taxes will have to rise or other spending, notably military, will have to shrink. We have done some illustrative arithmetic simulations to show what will happen to the debt if deficit targets are met and the spending rule is honored. Varying the growth rate shows that the 60% debt target should be met somewhere between 2018 and 2021. In these scenarios, stabilizing spending as a share of GDP requires growth of 3% per year. But that growth rate would not suffice to hold revenues constant and reach the deficit target. Some growth rate of something around 3.5% looks like it would be required. The recent political debate seems to have accepted that more tax revenues are acceptable, and a range of measures recommended by the Trachtenberg Committee has just been legislated. Our preliminary assessment is that they will not prove overly harmful to the nation's competitiveness. But it seems likely that unless growth is surprisingly strong in the coming years, revenue-raising measures will prove necessary. Indeed, no doubt many feel that further rises would be appropriate now. Our view is that if direct tax, especially corporate tax, or Social Security contributions were to be further increased, this would risk inflicting more serious economic costs in terms of growth outcomes and might not generate that much extra revenue anyway. We do think, however, that the taxation of housing could be stiffened, especially on capital gains. Greater greening of the tax system could also help. Fuel excise charges could be raised, as could the various charges for car use. What we most fervently counsel against is any calls for widening exemptions to VAT for social reasons, because that is an inefficient way of providing social protection. Indeed, we believe that even at 16% standard rate of VAT, there is room for an upward adjustment in that standard rate. Any unwanted impact on the poor could be dealt with by partially offsetting targeted transfers through an enhanced earned income tax credit, for example, what you call the negative income tax, I think. We have also a number of other things to say about fiscal policy. Because it is so unusual, we have given some thought to the two-year budget process that you have used since 2009, Minister Steinitz's pet project. It is obviously less resource-intensive and yields administrative savings, but it has downsides too. First, it places a heavy demand on revenue and spending projections that are already always of necessity off the mark in traditional annual frameworks. Second, worthwhile reforms may be delayed until a new budget cycle begins, since many of those reforms require accompanying budget